Hello everyone, my name is Fernandez, and today I'll be presenting my research titled The Moral Dilemma of Media Piracy Under Restrictive Digital Markets. This presentation explores why piracy becomes ethically complicated when legal media services make access more difficult than illegal alternatives. Moving on to slide 2. Here's a quick overview of what I'll go over today. First, I'll explain the background and significance of the piracy debate. Next, I'll compare how digital media systems differ between the United States and the European Union. Then, I'll analyze the ethics of piracy using a utilitarian framework. Finally, I'll summarize the key findings and discuss what they mean for consumers, the companies behind them, and policymakers. Slide 3. Background and significance. To understand why piracy is so widespread today, we need to look at how modern digital services operate. As media consumption moved to digital platforms, companies introduced DRM restrictions, confusing licensing rules, and regional barriers. For many people, the act of piracy doesn't feel like they're breaking a crime. It feels like the only option they have. As Breaky argues, piracy often becomes a form of principled law breaking when users feel the system itself is unjust. For slide 4, we'll be looking into consumer behavior. Most people actually want to consume media legally, but their behavior strongly depends on accessibility, convenience, and price. Studies from MIS Quarterly show that when services are too expensive or complicated, users will turn to piracy, even if they would have rather paid. Donaher and colleagues also found that strict enforcement doesn't actually reduce the rate of piracy unless the legal options are easy to access and reasonably priced. Moving on to slide 5. Restricted access doesn't just inconvenience people, it limits cultural participation. When movies, shows, or music aren't available because of where someone lives, or because they can't afford multiple subscription services, they lose the ability to engage in global cultural conversations. Breaky and Geiger both argue that limiting access to knowledge and culturally relevant media creates an ethical dilemma. Should people follow strict copyright laws, or should they participate in modern culture? And you see this everywhere, like a new show comes out and not everyone has Hulu or Netflix, but they want to watch it because all their friends are watching it. In their mind, the most logical route is to pirate it. It doesn't make sense to pay full price for an expensive subscription service that they're only going to use for one show. So with all that said, is it any wonder why piracy has become more normalized? Now let's look at it in the US market. The United States is one of the best examples of a fragmented digital market. Streaming platforms constantly shift licenses, forcing users to pay for multiple subscription services at once. This is even worse for sports media, where regional restrictions and exclusive streaming rights make access extremely frustrating. Despite strong enforcement of copyright laws, the US still has some of the highest piracy rates, largely because legal access is unreliable and expensive. Now for the European Union market. The European Union takes a different approach. Through the Digital Single Market Initiative, the EU has actively worked to reduce regional barriers and make their digital content more accessible across borders. Although fragmentation still exists, European consumers face far fewer limitations than US consumers. This has contributed to significantly lower piracy rates across the EU, showing that accessibility, not the harsher punishment, is a more effective solution. Now, when we compare them, we see a clear pattern. When legal access is simple and affordable, the piracy goes down. When access is fragmented, expensive, or very arbitrary, the piracy goes up. This supports the idea that ethical evaluations of piracy depend very heavily on how fair and functional the legal market is. It's not just about the law, it's about whether the system serves the public. Moving on to slide 9, utilitarian ethics. Let's look at piracy through a utilitarian framework. Utilitarian ethics will focus on maximizing the overall well-being and minimizing harm for society as a whole. Instead of asking, is this legal? Utilitarianism asks, does this action produce better consequences for all involved? Now for the actual analysis. Under utilitarianism, the act of piracy becomes a complicated issue. On one hand, it harms the copyright owners by reducing the profits and undermining their distribution models. On the other hand, when access is heavily restricted, the act of piracy can increase social utility by allowing cultural participation, education, and communication. Breaky argues that when laws impose unreasonable burdens, people may be morally justified in breaking them if it promotes greater justice or well-being. Empirical studies also show that most people do pirating because they're bypassing the restrictions placed on them, not because they want to harm the creators. Moving on. A key point here is that piracy is still illegal, but legality doesn't always determine ethics. Geiger argues that access to information and culture is becoming a fundamental right. So if legal services fail to provide that access, the balance of utility may actually shift in favor of piracy. This doesn't erase the legal consequences, but it shows why many people believe that piracy is ethically defensible in certain situations. So, in conclusion, my research shows 3 key points. First, restrictive licensing, fragmented platforms, and regional blocks significantly increase the rate of piracy. Second, the global comparisons show that systems like the EU, where access is easier, see much lower levels of piracy. And third, from a utilitarian perspective, overly restrictive systems weaken the ethical argument against the use of piracy. Ultimately, improving accessibility and reducing artificial barriers like region locking is the most effective way to reduce piracy while maintaining ethical legitimacy. And finally, let's look at the references. Here are the cited sources I use in my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. And here are the links and references for the images I used in my presentation.